The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Colonel James Mitchell adjusted his dress uniform one final time. The 58-year-old veteran had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, earning the Distinguished Service Cross and the Military Cross for his extraordinary bravery under fire. His weathered hands, scarred from shrapnel wounds sustained during a rescue mission in Helmand Province, trembled slightly as he fastened the final button on his ceremonial jacket. Today was supposed to be the pinnacle of his military career. He was to be escorted by the Queen's Guard to receive a special commendation for his humanitarian work with wounded veterans. The journey to this moment had been long and difficult. After retiring from active duty 5 years earlier, Mitchell could have easily settled into a quiet civilian life. Instead, he chose to continue serving his country in a different way. He had witnessed too many of his fellow soldiers struggling with the transition back to civilian life, battling invisible wounds that were often more devastating than any physical injury. The statistics haunted him: veteran suicide rates, homelessness, addiction, unemployment. These numbers represented real people he had served alongside. Men and women who had given everything for their country only to find themselves forgotten and abandoned. Using his military pension and the modest inheritance left by his parents, Mitchell had established the first rehabilitation center in Manchester. The facility wasn't much to look at initially, converted warehouse in an industrial district, but it became a beacon of hope for veterans who had nowhere else to turn. Mitchell personally interviewed every applicant, spending hours listening to their stories, understanding their struggles, and crafting individual recovery plans. He hired former military personnel as counselors and job placement specialists, creating an environment where veterans felt understood and valued. The success of the Manchester Center led to expansion. Within 3 years, Mitchell had opened facilities in Birmingham, Glasgow, and Cardiff. Each center was designed not just to provide services, but to recreate the sense of brotherhood and purpose that many veterans missed after leaving military service. The facilities included workshops where veterans could learn new trades, counseling centers staffed by professionals who understood military culture, and recreation areas where former soldiers could maintain physical fitness and competitive spirit. What made Mitchell's approach unique was his personal involvement. He didn't just write checks and attend board meetings. He was there every day, working alongside the staff and participants. Veterans would often find him in the workshops at 6 a.m., helping set up equipment or reviewing job applications. He attended graduation ceremonies, celebrated successful job placements, and provided emergency support when participants faced crises. His phone was available 24 hours a day to any veteran who needed help, and he had personally driven to crisis situations countless times, often in the middle of the night. The impact was extraordinary. Over 2,000 veterans had passed through Mitchell's programs, an 87% success rate in finding employment and stable housing. More importantly, the suicide attempt rate among program participants dropped to nearly zero. Veterans who entered the programs broken and hopeless left with renewed purpose and the skills needed to build meaningful civilian lives. Many became advocates themselves, turning to help newer participants navigate their own recovery journeys. Mitchell's work hadn't gone unnoticed by the royal family. Prince William, himself a veteran and advocate for military mental health, had visited the Manchester facility the previous year. He spent hours touring the workshops, speaking with participants, and learning about Mitchell's innovative approaches to veteran rehabilitation. The prince was particularly impressed by the program's focus on peer support and the way it preserved military camaraderie while teaching civilian life skills. The recommendation for royal recognition came directly from Prince William's office, supported by testimonials from hundreds of veterans, their families, and community leaders. The letter of commendation spoke of Mitchell's extraordinary dedication to serving those who have served and his innovative approach to healing the invisible wounds of war. It was an honor that had never before been bestowed on someone working in veteran rehabilitation, making this day truly historic. As Mitchell walked through the palace grounds that morning, he thought about the veterans who couldn't be there to share this moment. There was Sergeant Davies, who had lost both legs to an ide, but had gone on to become a master carpenter through Mitchell's program. Corporal Smith, who had battled PTSD for years before finding peace through the center's counseling services and now worked as a peer counselor herself. Major Thompson, whose struggle with alcoholism had nearly destroyed his family until Mitchell's intervention helped him rebuild his relationships and find new purpose. Each success story represented countless hours of work, moments of doubt, and small victories that accumulated into life-changing transformations. Mitchell never took credit for these achievements. He always insisted that the veterans themselves deserved the recognition for their courage in seeking help and their determination to rebuild their lives. But everyone who knew him understood that, without his vision, dedication, and personal sacrifice, thousands of veterans would still be struggling alone. The media attention surrounding today's ceremony had been overwhelming. News outlets from around the world had requested interviews. Wanting to understand how one man had created such an effective network of veteran support services, Mitchell had reluctantly agreed to a few interviews, always directing attention away from himself and toward the veterans he served. He hoped that the publicity would inspire others to support veteran causes and perhaps lead to government funding for similar programs across the country. His wife Margaret had been his constant supporter throughout this journey. Despite her own battle with cancer, she had helped design the rehabilitation programs, managed administrative details, and provided emotional support to countless veterans and their families. Her illness had been diagnosed 2 years earlier. The treatments had been grueling, but she insisted on attending today's ceremony. "I wouldn't miss seeing my husband receive the recognition he deserves," she had told the doctors. Even though the chemotherapy had left her weak and exhausted, as the time for the ceremony approached, Mitchell felt a mixture of pride and humility. This recognition wasn't just for him. It was validation for every veteran who had participated in his programs, every family member who had supported their recovery, and every staff member who had dedicated their careers to helping others heal. It was also a message to society that veterans' service didn't end when they left the military, and that their successful reintegration benefited everyone. The palace courtyard began to fill with distinguished guests, media representatives, and most importantly, veterans and their families who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. Many wore their old uniforms, medals polished and gleaming in the morning sunlight. Some carried photographs of fallen comrades, wanting to include their memory in this celebration of military service and sacrifice. The Queen's Guard had been preparing for this moment since dawn. Captain Sarah Williams, the first female officer to lead a royal escort in over a century, stood at attention, reviewing her formation one final time. At 34, I'd already distinguished herself through multiple deployments and had specifically requested this assignment when she learned about Colonel Mitchell's work. Having served in Afghanistan herself, she understood the challenges veterans faced upon returning home and felt deeply honored to be part of recognizing someone who had dedicated his retirement to helping others heal. The formation was impeccable. 8 guards in their iconic red tunics and towering bearskin hats stood in perfect alignment, their ceremonial rifles held at precisely the correct angle. Each guard had been selected not only for their military bearing, but also for their personal connection to veteran issues. Sergeant Major Thompson had served alongside Mitchell in Afghanistan and had personally witnessed the colonel's bravery during a Taliban ambush that saved 12 lives. Corporal Jenkins had lost his brother in Iraq and deeply respected Mitchell's humanitarian work. Guard Williams had participated in one of Mitchell's counseling sessions for female veterans, finding the support invaluable in her own transition to civilian leadership roles. The guards had spent weeks rehearsing this escort, understanding that every movement would be scrutinized by millions of viewers worldwide. This wasn't just another ceremonial duty. It was a chance to honor one of their own, a veteran who had never stopped serving his country. The pride in their ranks was palpable as they prepared to march alongside a true hero, someone who embodied the military values of service, sacrifice, and dedication to others. Media crews had been setting up since 5 a.m. With broadcast trucks lining the street outside the palace gates, representatives from BBC, ITV, Sky News, International outlets, including CNN and Al Jazeera, had all requested exclusive coverage rights. The story had captured global attention, a decorated war hero being honored not for his battlefield achievements, but for his compassionate work helping fellow veterans rebuild their lives. It was exactly the kind of positive military story that resonated with audiences. Tired of hearing only about conflict and controversy, the ceremonial route had been carefully planned to maximize the symbolic impact. The escort would begin at the Victoria Memorial, proceed through the palace gates, and culminate at the Grand Hall, where Mitchell would receive his commendation. Every step had been choreographed to honor both military tradition and the significance of veteran rehabilitation work. Royal protocol officers had worked closely with veteran organizations to ensure the ceremony would be meaningful to the military community while maintaining the dignity expected of royal occasions. Hundreds of veterans and their families had gathered along the processional route, many arriving before sunrise to secure the best viewing positions. They came from every corner of the United Kingdom, former soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who had heard about Mitchell's work and wanted to show their support. Some traveled despite significant physical disabilities, using wheelchairs or walking with prosthetics. Others overcame anxiety and depression that made public gatherings difficult, motivated by their desire to honor someone who had helped so many of their brothers and sisters in arms. The atmosphere among the waiting crowd was electric with anticipation and pride. Veterans shared stories about Mitchell's impact on their lives or the lives of people they knew. A former Royal Marine described how Mitchell's Birmingham Center had helped his son overcome addiction and find stable employment after struggling for years. A widow spoke about how Mitchell had personally counseled her family after her husband's suicide, providing support that made the difference between despair and healing. These personal testimonies created a powerful sense of community among the gathered crowd. Television commentators began their live coverage, explaining the significance of the ceremony and providing background on Mitchell's remarkable post-military career. Military historians noted that this was the first time in modern royal history that someone had been honored specifically for veteran rehabilitation work. The ceremony represented a shift in how society viewed military service, not just as something that ended with discharge, but as a foundation for continued service to others. As 10:30 a.m. approached, the excitement reached fever pitch. The Queen's Guard moved into final position, their movements precise and coordinated. Captain Williams received final instructions through her earpiece, confirming that all security protocols had been completed and the ceremony was cleared to proceed. The guards could see Colonel Mitchell approaching from the distance, his distinguished bearing evident even from afar. The media cameras began rolling, broadcasting live to audiences across the globe. Social media platforms filled with messages of support and admiration for Mitchell's work. Veterans organizations had been promoting the event for weeks, encouraging their members to watch and share the broadcast. The hashtag Hero Helps Heroes had been trending since early morning, with thousands of posts celebrating both Mitchell's achievements and the broader importance of veteran support services. Palace officials made final checks on security arrangements and ceremonial protocols. Lord Chamberlain Sir Richard Ashworth, himself a veteran of the Falklands conflict, had personally overseen every detail of the ceremony. He understood the deep significance of this moment for the veteran community and was determined to ensure that Mitchell received the recognition he deserved with appropriate pomp and circumstance. The timing had to be perfect. Royal ceremonies operated on precise schedules, with every movement calculated to the second. The Queen's Guard would begin their march at exactly 10:30, arriving at the ceremonial position at 10:35, where they would wait for Colonel Mitchell to approach. The formal escort would then begin, proceeding at the traditional pace that allowed spectators to fully appreciate the solemnity of the occasion. Weather conditions were ideal. Clear skies with gentle morning sunshine that illuminated the palace grounds beautifully. The forecast had been a concern for weeks, as rain would have complicated the ceremony and disappointed the thousands of spectators who had traveled to witness this historic moment. The perfect weather seemed fitting for such a positive occasion. celebration of service and compassion that offered hope in troubled times. Security. Preparations had been extensive but discreet. This was a joyous occasion that required protection without creating an atmosphere of tension or fear. Plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd, alert but unobtrusive. Barriers had been positioned to control crowd flow while maintaining the ceremonial dignity of the processional route. Every effort had been made to ensure that security measures enhanced rather than detracted from the celebratory atmosphere. The band of the Coldstream Guards had taken their position, ready to provide musical accompaniment for the escort. They had prepared a selection of traditional military marches along with more contemporary pieces that reflected the modern nature of Mitchell's service. The music would begin as soon as the escort formation started moving, providing an audio backdrop that would enhance the visual spectacle for both live spectators and television audiences. As the final minutes approached, a sense of anticipation filled the air. This was more than just another royal ceremony, it was a celebration of the very best of military values. A recognition that service to others extends far beyond the battlefield. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something special. A moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The atmosphere changed dramatically when Thomas Bradley approached the Queen's Guard formation. The 29-year-old security protocol officer had been transferred to the palace detail. Just 3 weeks earlier from a routine government building assignment, his previous experience involved checking identification badges and ensuring visitors signed proper logbooks. Nothing remotely comparable to the complex ceremonial protocols surrounding royal events. Bradley was known among his colleagues for his rigid interpretation of regulations and his inability to adapt procedures to unique circumstances. Bradley had discovered what he believed to be a critical security flaw while reviewing the morning's paperwork. Colonel Mitchell's security clearance, while complete and approved through all traditional channels, was missing a single digital verification stamp from a new electronic system that had been implemented only 4 days earlier. The system was still in its testing phase, and most senior security officers were treating it as supplementary to existing procedures. However, Bradley interpreted the missing stamp as a serious breach of protocol that required immediate action, without consulting his supervisors or considering the extraordinary circumstances. Bradley marched directly toward the Queen's Guard formation. His approach was noticed first by Sergeant Major Thompson, who had been scanning the crowd and perimeter as part of his security awareness training. Thompson's expression shifted from professional alertness to confusion as he watched the junior security officer stride purposefully toward their formation. Something in Bradley's bearing suggested trouble, and Thompson subtly alerted Captain Williams through their internal communication. System Bradley reached the formation at precisely 10:28 a.m. Just 2 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Millions of viewers were already watching the live broadcast, and the crowd of spectators had fallen into expectant silence. The timing couldn't have been worse, so from Bradley's perspective, more necessary. He believed he was preventing a massive security breach that could have international implications. "Stop," Bradley shouted, his voice cutting through the morning air with startling authority. The word echoed off the palace walls and was captured by every microphone in the area. Broadcasting his interruption to audiences worldwide, "This escort cannot proceed. The principal lacks proper security verification according to Protocol Section 15C of the revised security manual." The impact was immediate and devastating. Captain Williams felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. She had spent weeks preparing for this ceremony, understanding its deep significance to the veteran community and the broader military family. The Queen's Guard had rehearsed every movement, every timing, every detail to ensure that Colonel Mitchell received the honor he deserved. Now, with cameras rolling and the world watching, their carefully planned tribute was being derailed by bureaucratic inflexibility. Colonel Mitchell stopped in his tracks. Approximately 50 yards from where he was meant to meet the Queen's Guard, his weathered face showed confusion rather than anger as he tried to understand what was happening. After decades of military service, he was accustomed to following orders and respecting chain of command, but this situation seemed surreal. He had completed every security requirement requested of him, submitted to background checks, and received written confirmation that all protocols had been satisfied. The crowd's reaction was swift and emotional. Veterans who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness this moment began expressing their displeasure with increasing volume. "What's going on?" someone shouted from the front row. "Let him through," came another voice, followed by a growing chorus of support for Mitchell and criticism of the security officer. Many in the crowd were veterans themselves who understood the profound significance of military recognition ceremonies and were appalled to see one being disrupted by what appeared to be petty bureaucracy. Media representatives scrambled to understand and report on the unfolding situation. Television commentators found themselves improvising explanations for viewers who had tuned in, expecting to see a heartwarming ceremony honoring veteran service. Social media platforms began flooding with real-time reactions from viewers expressing outrage, confusion, and support for Colonel Mitchell. The hashtag let him through began trending within minutes as the incident gained international attention. Bradley seemed oblivious to the chaos he had created. He pulled out a folder containing security protocols and began explaining to Captain Williams that the ceremony could not proceed without proper digital verification. His voice carried the tone of someone who believed he was performing essential duties rather than destroying a meaningful celebration. He quoted regulation numbers and procedural requirements, while ignoring the increasingly hostile crowd and the obvious distress of everyone involved in the ceremony. Captain Williams maintained her military composure despite her fury. She had been trained to handle unexpected situations with dignity and professionalism, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this scenario. Through clenched teeth, she asked Bradley to step aside so she could consult with her commanding officer about resolving the issue. Bradley refused, stating that security protocols took precedence over all other considerations, including ceremonial duties. The other Queen's guards remained at attention, but their faces showed the strain of watching their carefully planned honor being destroyed. These were professional soldiers who understood the importance of following orders, but they were also veterans who recognized the injustice being done to one of their own. Sergeant Major Thompson's jaw was clenched so tightly that other guards could see his facial muscles bulging beneath his ceremonial uniform. The internal conflict between military discipline and personal outrage was visible in every guard's bearing. Palace officials began receiving urgent communications about the situation unfolding in the courtyard. Lord Chamberlain Sir Richard Ashworth was in a meeting with senior staff when his assistant burst in with news of the disruption. The Lord Chamberlain's first reaction was disbelief. How could a routine ceremony honoring veteran service be derailed by a security technicality? He immediately excused himself from the meeting and began making urgent calls to resolve the situation. Margaret Mitchell, watching from her designated seat in the family viewing area, began to cry as she realized what was happening to her husband. The cancer treatments had left her physically weak, but her emotional strength had carried her through months of difficult therapy so she could be present for this moment. Seeing her husband being humiliated in front of millions of viewers was more painful than any medical procedure she had endured. The standoff continued with Bradley, insisting that he was following proper protocols, while everyone around him recognized the absurdity of the situation. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the hostile reaction, apparently believing that others should appreciate his attention to security details rather than criticizing his timing and inflexibility. His training had emphasized the importance of following procedures exactly, but had failed to teach him when common sense and human decency should override bureaucratic requirements. Television coverage began shifting from ceremonial coverage to crisis reporting. Commentators struggled to explain how such a situation could occur during a royal ceremony that had been planned for months and approved at the highest levels. Military experts began weighing in on the importance of flexibility in security protocols and the need to balance safety concerns with ceremonial significance. The incident was becoming an international embarrassment for the royal family and the British military. What should have been a positive story about veteran support and royal recognition was turning into a cautionary tale about bureaucratic inflexibility and poor judgment. The longer the standoff continued, the more damage was being done to everyone involved except Bradley, who seemed incapable of recognizing the magnitude of his mistake. The situation reached a critical point when Bradley announced that the entire ceremony would need to be postponed indefinitely until the paperwork could be properly processed through official channels. His words, broadcast live to millions of viewers, created an immediate explosion of outrage from the assembled crowd. Veterans who had waited hours to witness this historic moment began shouting protests, their voices mixing into an angry chorus that grew louder with each passing second. "This is disgraceful," shouted retired Major Patricia Coleman, who had lost her right arm in a roadside bombing and had driven 6 hours from Scotland to attend the ceremony. Her voice carried across the courtyard as she struggled to stand from her wheelchair, supported by her teenage daughter. "That man has given everything for his country and continues to serve every day. How dare you treat him like this?" The media coverage intensified as reporters realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in royal ceremony history. Camera crews began focusing on the growing tension between Bradley and the increasingly hostile crowd. International news networks interrupted their regular programming to cover what was being described as a security crisis at Buckingham Palace. However, unlike typical security incidents involving external threats, this crisis was entirely self-created by bureaucratic inflexibility. Sergeant Major Thompson, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with Colonel Mitchell, made an unprecedented decision. While maintaining his position in the Queen's Guard formation, spoke directly to Bradley, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military experience and barely controlled anger. "Sir, with all due respect, you're making a terrible mistake. Colonel Mitchell has served this country with distinction for 35 years. He saved lives in combat and continued saving lives in retirement. Your paperwork is not more important than honoring genuine heroism." Thompson's words resonated through the crowd and across the airwaves. Here was a senior military professional, bound by strict disciplinary codes and ceremonial protocols, publicly challenging a security decision because it violated every principle of military honor and respect. His intervention represented something far more significant than a procedural dispute. It was a moral stand against bureaucracy that had lost sight of its purpose. Other members of the Queen's Guard began showing subtle signs of support for Thompson's position. While they couldn't break formation or speak out directly, their body language conveyed solidarity with their sergeant major and disgust with the situation unfolding before them. Guard Williams felt torn between her duty to follow security protocols and her personal conviction that a grave injustice was being committed against a war hero who deserved better treatment. Bradley appeared genuinely surprised by the hostile reaction to his decision. In his limited experience, security protocols were absolute requirements that superseded all other considerations. He had been trained to identify potential security breaches and take immediate action to prevent them. But his training had never addressed situations where rigid adherence to procedures could cause more harm than good. His inability to recognize the broader implications of his actions was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone except himself. The crowd's anger was reaching dangerous levels as more people began pushing forward toward the security barriers. Palace security officers found themselves in the unusual position of potentially needing to protect one of their own colleagues from an increasingly hostile crowd of veterans and military families. The irony wasn't lost on anyone security personnel might need protection from the very people the ceremony was meant to honor. Social media platforms exploded with real-time reactions from viewers worldwide. The hashtag #securityfailure began trending alongside hashtag let him through as millions of people expressed outrage at the treatment of Colonel Mitchell. Veterans organizations began issuing emergency statements, condemning the incident and calling for immediate resolution. The American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and similar organizations from allied nations posted messages of support for Mitchell and criticism of the bureaucratic nightmare that was unfolding. Margaret Mitchell's emotional breakdown was captured by cameras and broadcast globally, creating an even more powerful reaction from viewers. the sight of a cancer-stricken woman crying as her war hero. Husband was publicly humiliated, touched hearts worldwide, and intensified demands for immediate action to resolve the crisis. Her dignity in the face of such treatment only highlighted the injustice of the entire situation. Lord Chamberlain, Sir Richard Ashworth arrived at the scene approximately 15 minutes after the crisis began, his face showing barely controlled fury as he assessed the situation. As a veteran himself, he understood the profound significance of military recognition ceremonies and was appalled that one had been derailed by what appeared to be bureaucratic incompetence. His first action was to demand a full briefing on exactly what had caused this disaster. Deputy Private Secretary Emma Davies was frantically making phone calls to legal advisors, trying to determine what authority existed to override Bradley's security concerns. The legal implications were complex if there truly was a security issue. Proceeding with the ceremony could create liability problems. However, if the security concerns were unfounded or grossly disproportionate to the actual risk, the damage to royal reputation and military morale could be severe. The standoff had now lasted over 20 minutes, turning what should have been a brief, dignified ceremony into an international incident. News outlets were beginning to run background pieces on both Colonel Mitchell's distinguished service record and the security protocols that had created this crisis. Military analysts were appearing on television to explain why veteran recognition ceremonies held such deep significance. For military communities worldwide, Prince William's office began receiving urgent communications about the incident. As a veteran himself and a vocal advocate for military mental health issues, the Prince was particularly invested in events that honored veteran service. His staff began making inquiries about what actions could be taken to resolve the crisis, while he considered whether personal intervention might be necessary or appropriate. The Queen's Guard formation began showing signs of strain as the extended standoff continued. These were professional soldiers trained for ceremonial duties, but they had never experienced anything like this situation. Captain Williams was receiving conflicting instructions through her communication system. Some officials wanted her to maintain position until the security issue was resolved, while others were suggesting she should proceed with the ceremony regardless of Bradley's objections. Colonel Mitchell, still standing alone approximately 50 yards from where he was meant to meet his escort, began to consider whether he should simply leave to avoid further embarrassment. His military training emphasized putting the mission above personal considerations. He was beginning to believe that his presence was causing more problems than his absence would solve. However, the crowd's vocal support made it clear that leaving would be seen as capitulation to bureaucratic bullying rather than dignified withdrawal. The incident was becoming a defining moment for how society treats its veterans. What had begun as a celebration of service and compassion was turning into a test of whether military values of honor, respect, and brotherhood could prevail over rigid bureaucracy and inflexible rule-following. The resolution of this crisis would send a message about national priorities and the real meaning of supporting those who had served their country with distinction. The turning point came when Margaret Mitchell, despite her weakened condition from months of cancer treatment, slowly rose from her wheelchair in the family viewing area. Her movement was noticed first by a BBC cameraman, who instinctively focused on her as she began making her way toward the security barrier that separated the family section from the main courtyard. Her daughter reached out to help her, but Margaret gently declined assistance. Determined to face this moment with the same strength that had carried her through chemotherapy sessions and radiation treatments, Margaret's walk across the courtyard was painful to watch, but impossible to ignore. Each step required tremendous effort, and her breathing was labored from the exertion. However, her face showed not weakness but determined resolve. She had been married to James Mitchell for 32 years, had supported him through 3 combat deployments, and had watched him dedicate his retirement to helping other veterans heal from their wounds. She would not stand by silently while bureaucratic foolishness destroyed this moment of recognition. For his lifelong service, the crowd fell silent as Margaret approached her husband, understanding instinctively that something significant was about to happen. Even Bradley seemed to recognize that the dynamic was shifting. though he remained convinced that his security concerns justified the disruption. Television commentators stopped their analysis as cameras focused on the cancer-stricken woman walking slowly but purposefully toward the center of this unprecedented crisis. When Margaret reached her husband, she took his arm with both of her thin hands and turned to face the cameras directly. Her voice, weakened by treatments but strengthened by conviction, carried clearly across the silent courtyard and into millions of homes worldwide. "My husband has given 35 years of his life to this country," she began, her words measured but passionate. "He's been shot at, bombed, and has lost friends in service to others. He spent his retirement helping broken soldiers find their way home, often using our own money when government funding wasn't available." Her pause for breath was audible in the perfect silence that had settled over the scene. "If a piece of paper is more important than that," she continued, "then perhaps we've forgotten what real honor looks like. James has never asked for recognition or rewards. He helps veterans because it's the right thing to do, because he can't sleep at night knowing that soldiers who serve beside him are struggling alone. Today was supposed to celebrate that service. But instead, we're witnessing bureaucracy at its absolute worst." Margaret's words had immediate and powerful impact. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to shake the palace walls. Television viewers flooded social media with messages of support and admiration for her courage in speaking truth to power. The contrast between her dignity and Bradley's inflexibility became the defining image of the entire incident. Here was a woman fighting cancer who had summoned the strength to defend her husband's honor, while a healthy young man hid behind paperwork to avoid making common sense decisions. The emotional impact of Margaret's intervention was amplified by the visual imagery being broadcast worldwide. The sight of a frail woman defending her war hero husband against bureaucratic obstruction created a narrative that transcended politics and touched universal themes of love, honor, and justice. News outlets began running split-screen coverage showing Margaret's speech alongside footage of Colonel Mitchell's rehabilitation centers and testimonials from veterans whose lives had been saved by his work. Lord Chamberlain, Sir Richard Ashworth, was deeply moved by Margaret's courage and immediately began taking decisive action to resolve the crisis. As a veteran of the Falklands War, he understood both the military significance of recognition ceremonies and the legal authorities that governed royal protocols. He pulled Bradley aside for a private conversation, explaining in unmistakable terms that the security officers' interpretation of procedures was causing irreparable damage to the royal family's reputation and the morale of the veteran community. Prince William's office made the decision to issue an immediate statement supporting Colonel Mitchell and expressing the prince's personal commitment to ensuring the ceremony proceeded as planned. The statement, released through royal social media channels, emphasized the prince's respect for Mitchell's service and his determination that bureaucratic complications would not prevent recognition of genuine heroism. The royal intervention added significant pressure for immediate resolution of the averts crisis. Bradley found himself increasingly isolated as senior officials made it clear that his security concerns, while potentially valid in other circumstances, were completely disproportionate to the actual situation. Multiple supervisors arrived on scene to review his decision-making and assess whether his actions were justified by genuine security needs or simply bureaucratic inflexibility. The consensus was rapidly forming that Bradley had created a crisis where none existed and had damaged everyone's reputation except his own. The crowd's reaction too. Margaret's speech had shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. What had been frustration and anger transformed into something more powerful, a collective determination to ensure that Colonel Mitchell received the honor he deserved regardless of bureaucratic obstacles. Veterans in the crowd began sharing their own stories about Mitchell's impact on their lives, creating an impromptu testimonial session that was captured by roving television cameras. Captain Williams received new instructions through her communication system, authorizing her to proceed with the ceremony once proper authority overruled the security hold. The Queen's Guard had maintained their formation throughout the crisis, showing remarkable discipline under extremely difficult circumstances. Their professionalism during the incident would later be praised as an example of military bearing under pressure. Though privately, many guards expressed frustration that it had taken so long to resolve such an obvious injustice. Social media platforms registered unprecedented engagement as the incident became a global talking point. Veterans organizations from dozens of countries issued statements of support for Colonel Mitchell and criticism of the bureaucratic handling of his recognition ceremony. The incident was being discussed not just as a British military story, but as an international example of how veteran service should be honored and protected from administrative interference. The resolution began when Sir Richard Ashworth, using his full authority as Lord Chamberlain, officially overruled Bradley's security hold and ordered the ceremony to proceed immediately. His decision was supported by legal advisors who confirmed that the missing digital verification stamp was a minor administrative detail that posed no actual security risk. The Lord Chamberlain's action was decisive and final. Leaving no room for further bureaucratic delays or objections, Bradley was quietly escorted away from the scene by senior security officials who made it clear that his career at the palace was effectively over. His rigid interpretation of procedures and inability to recognize the broader implications of his actions had created an international incident that embarrassed the royal family and caused unnecessary pain to a war hero and his family. While he might have believed he was following proper protocols, his lack of judgment and flexibility had proven catastrophic. The crowd's reaction to news that the ceremony would finally proceed was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers erupted across the courtyard as people realized that justice was finally being done. Veterans wiped away tears of relief and pride, while family members embraced each other in celebration. The emotional roller coaster of the past 30 minutes was finally ending with the right outcome. Though the damage to everyone's nerves and the royal family's reputation had been severe, the ceremony that finally proceeded was unlike anything in royal protocol history. What should have been a formal, reserved affair had been transformed by the preceding crisis into an intensely emotional celebration of service, sacrifice, and the triumph of human dignity over bureaucratic obstruction. Captain Williams, her voice slightly hoarse with suppressed emotion, called her Queen's Guard back to perfect formation. As the 8 guards snapped to attention with precision that somehow seemed more meaningful after their long ordeal, the crowd erupted in applause that could be heard blocks away from the palace grounds. Colonel Mitchell began his walk toward the Queen's Guard. But this time, his approach carried far more significance than originally planned. Every step represented not just his personal journey to recognition, but a victory for military values over petty bureaucracy. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he covered the distance that had been denied to him for 30 agonizing minutes. Their collective breath held as if witnessing a sacred ritual finally being allowed to unfold. When Mitchell finally reached the Queen's Guard formation, something extraordinary happened. Sergeant Major Thompson, despite strict ceremonial protocols that required guards to remain silent and motionless, spoke quietly to the colonel. "Sir, it's an honor to escort you today. What just happened was wrong, but what you've done for our brothers and sisters in arms is right, and that's what matters." His words violated every rule of ceremonial conduct, but they captured the sentiment of every guard present and resonated with millions watching worldwide. The escort formation began moving with the traditional measured pace of royal ceremonies, but the atmosphere was charged with emotion that no protocol manual could have anticipated. As they walked, many of the guards had tears in their eyes, tears of anger at the injustice they had witnessed, tears of pride in finally being able to honor a true hero, and tears of relief that dignity had ultimately prevailed over bureaucracy. The sight of these elite soldiers openly showing emotion added powerful humanity to the formal proceedings. The crowd's reaction throughout the escort was overwhelming. Veterans lining the route called out words of support and gratitude to Mitchell. "Thank you for everything," shouted one former Royal Marine. "You saved my son's life," cried a mother whose veteran child had been helped by Mitchell's rehabilitation programs. The spontaneous testimonials created a chorus of appreciation that accompanied the entire processional route. Margaret Mitchell, supported by her daughter and palace medical staff, watched with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph as her husband finally received the honor he deserved. The physical effort of her intervention had drained her limited energy reserves, but the emotional satisfaction of seeing justice done provided strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her courage in speaking out had become as much a part of the day's story as her husband's lifetime of service. The band of the Coldstream Guards, which had been waiting in anxious silence during the crisis, began playing with unusual passion and precision. Their performance of traditional military marches seemed to carry extra meaning after the morning's events, each note a declaration that military honor and respect could not be defeated by administrative incompetence. The music provided a stirring soundtrack to Mitchell's long-delayed moment of recognition when the escort reached the Grand Hall. The formal presentation ceremony began with modifications that acknowledged what had transpired. Lord Chamberlain Sir Richard Ashworth, reading the commendation, added personal remarks about the importance of flexibility, judgment, and human decency in all official actions. His words served both to honor Mitchell's achievements and to ensure that similar incidents could never recur through improved training and clearer authority structures. The commendation itself praised Mitchell's extraordinary dedication to healing the invisible wounds of war and his innovative approaches to veteran rehabilitation that have saved thousands of lives and restored hope to countless military families. The formal language seemed inadequate to capture the full scope of his impact, but the ceremony's emotional context provided meaning beyond any written citation could convey. Prince William made an unscheduled appearance at the ceremony, having decided that royal presence was necessary to demonstrate full support for Mitchell and to repair damage to the monarchy's reputation. His personal participation transformed the event from a standard recognition ceremony into a statement about royal values and priorities. The prince spoke movingly about Mitchell's work and the importance of supporting those who had served their country with distinction. The immediate aftermath of the ceremony saw unprecedented media coverage and public response. News outlets worldwide reported the story as an example of bureaucracy gone wrong, but also as a testament to the power of individual courage and dignity in the face of institutional failure. Margaret Mitchell's intervention was particularly praised as an act of remarkable bravery that had shamed officials into doing the right thing. Within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, the palace announced a comprehensive review of all security protocols to ensure that future ceremonial events could never be disrupted by similar bureaucratic inflexibility. New training programs would be implemented for all security staff, emphasizing the importance of judgment, flexibility, and understanding the broader context of their responsibilities. The review would be led by senior military officers who understood both security requirements and ceremonial significance. Thomas Bradley's career at the palace ended immediately following the incident. While he had believed he was following proper procedures, his superiors concluded that his lack of judgment and inability to adapt to exceptional circumstances made him unsuitable for ceremonial security duties. He was transferred to a position where rigid adherence to procedures was more appropriate than flexible problem-solving. The long-term impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate participants. Veterans organizations reported increased support and donations following the global attention drawn to Mitchell's work. His rehabilitation programs received additional funding that allowed expansion into new regions and the development of innovative treatment approaches. The crisis had inadvertently created greater awareness of veteran needs and the importance of supporting those who continued serving their country in civilian roles. Social media analysis showed that the incident had generated more positive engagement with military and veteran issues than any event in recent memory. The hashtag #TrueHonor, which emerged during the ceremony's conclusion, used to share thousands of stories about veteran service and sacrifice. The global conversation sparked by one man's recognition ceremony had created lasting awareness about the ongoing challenges faced by military veterans worldwide. Colonel Mitchell's story became a case study in leadership, programs in military academies, illustrating how individual dedication to service could extend far beyond formal military careers. His example inspired other veterans to develop their own support programs and encouraged government agencies to improve their assistance for transitioning service members. The incident that had nearly derailed his recognition ultimately amplified his impact exponentially. The ceremony concluded with Mitchell receiving not just his formal commendation, but also the knowledge that his moment of crisis had been transformed into a platform for advancing veteran causes globally. What bureaucratic inflexibility had intended to diminish? Human courage and dignity had elevated beyond all original expectations. The day that began as recognition for one man's service became a celebration of military values that would inspire support for veterans for years to come.